When I was preparing this week for the service, it was just the title and the topic that caught my mind and caught my eye, and this poem literally flew off the page to me. It's called The Sandhills by Linda Hogan. The language of cranes, we once were told, is the wind. The wind is their method, their current, the translated story of life they write across the sky. Millions of years they have blown here on ancestral longing, their wings of wide arrival, necks long, legs stretched out above strands of earth, where they arrive with the shine of water. Stories, interminable language of exchanges descended from the sky, and then they stand, earth made only of crane, from bank to bank of the river, as far as you can see, the ancient story made new. Partial clearing. Jesus and Maria step out of the shadows, look up at the mountain, the cedar, the pine. Refresh in the streams that line your palm, your brow. Don't stoop in the furrows, the rows. Rise up in the orchards, the vineyards, the fields. The fruit, it is sweet, the lettuce not rotting. Crawl out of the caverns that nurture tristeza, despair. The skies are clearing. Relinquish your fear, at least for now. Gather carnations from earth that you've plowed, from gardens in cities you've loved, then left. The laughter of children, it scatters like petals, like leaves. O Jesus y Maria, Rosalita and Juan, you are not deportees. The moment. The moment when, after many years of hard work and a long voyage, you stand in the center of your room, house, half acre, square mile, country, knowing at last how you got there and say, I own this, is the same moment when the trees unloose their soft arms from around you, the birds take back their language, the cliffs fissure and collapse, the air moves back from you like a wave and you can't breathe. No, they whisper, you own nothing. You were a visitor, time after time, climbing the hill, planting the flag, proclaiming, we never belonged to you. You never found us. It was always the other way around.
So we had gathered in a bright room, plenty of space for everyone to line up on one side all together. And then our leader had an invitation for us each to take one step forward if a statement applied to us. Maybe you've done something similar. So we all lined up on one side, and we looked forward in this room filled with light and clarity. And then the statements were read. It was assumed from a young age that you would go to college, and I took a step forward. Your parents do not have a foreign accent where you live, and I took a step forward. You grew up in a house owned by your parents, and I took a step forward. You have never gone homeless or hungry for more than a day out of necessity, and I took a step forward. You don't have to worry about being catcalled on the street because of your gender or clothing, and I took a step forward. You can take a job with an employer who believes in affirmative action without having coworkers suspect that you got that job because of your race, and I took a step forward. You can look in mainstream media and see wide, fair representation of people who look like you, and I took a step forward. You can go shopping most of the time pretty well assured that you will not be followed or harassed, and I took a step forward. You never think twice about calling the police when trouble occurs, and I took a step forward. Schools in your community teach about your race and your heritage and always present it in positive ways, and I took a step forward. You can expect to see people of your race and gender represented in leadership, in positions in business, education, and government in your community without question, and I took a step forward. You can walk down the street in your neighborhood, you can spend time outdoors without fear of being harassed or followed or questioned, and I took a step forward. As I moved across the room, I quickly became alone on my walk. No one on either side of me. As I faced this way, I couldn't see any of my colleagues any longer, as the only straight white male in the class. And when I was asked to turn around, as we all were, I saw on the far other side people scattered in the middle, but on the far other side, colleagues whose faces were now blurry because of distance, because of this chasm of privilege. Some of my colleagues of color never taking one step forward out of 35 questions. The gulf of privilege between us, the separation between us, made it easy for me to ignore them, to not even see them really as human anymore, to only see the shadow of a person. Sometimes you have to get closer to even realize what you're supposed to look at. Sometimes you have to get closer to see the details, the specifics, the particulars of someone else's experience. The question for me, which is always the question that persists, is how do I acknowledge that distance? How do I acknowledge it without trying to quickly or easily fix it or mend it? I mean, I was born in southern Minnesota. I am conflict averse. I don't want there to be conflict. I want to fix things quickly, make it okay, mend it. So the challenge for me, maybe for some of you, how do I notice it and pay attention to it? To see clearly through it, so that experience of the soul, the heart breaking open might become a little more clear, or I might grow a little more compassion about that separation. How do I hold the realities that live within me, the complexity of identity and culture and class, the complexity of the very land I grew up on and call home? How do I hold my varied identities within? And how to hold those identities, those parts of me, those different narratives, without excessive pride on one side and without excessive shame on the other. Just enough of each to be proud of who I am and the story of my people, and humble enough to acknowledge the difference of stories, and humble enough to acknowledge my story is one among many, and it impacts others. And this world is not an even playing field. Minnesotan, blue-collar family, never having much money. I didn't grow up thinking our family was particularly privileged in any way. Some of my earliest memories were collecting cans in the neighborhood as a young child in the local park, which for me at the time was a fun summertime project. But in reality, it was helping to supplement our income after we moved in the bad housing market in Winnebago, Minnesota, leaving our home for nothing. It wasn't sold for anything in the market. And we moved to North Mankato, and we struggled. I didn't feel particularly privileged, but at the same time, I didn't feel particularly impoverished. I was somewhat in the middle. It felt like somewhere in the center of all these complex and competing identities. Not rich, but not exactly poor. Not privileged, I thought, but never fearful or treated differently or unfairly because I was a nice, quiet kid. I thought that must have been the reason why I wasn't treated any different. But we know it's more than that. My look, my style, my skin, my language, my gender identity, my family structure, it was all normative in the community that I called home. And being normative is of significant impact for how one experiences the world, being normative in your community, no matter how small or big it might seem. The moment, writes Margaret Atwood, when after many years of hard work and a long voyage, you stand in the center of your room, your house, your half acre, your square mile, your island, your country, knowing at last how you got there, and you say, I own this. is the same moment the trees unloose their soft arms around you. The birds take back their language. The air moves back from you like a wave and you can't breathe. No, they whisper. You own nothing. You are a visitor. Climbing that hill, planting that flag, proclaiming that you own this land, it never belonged to you. That's a hard thing. You own nothing. That I own nothing. This land that I've called home, that my family has called home for generations, the southern Minnesota prairie that I love, I don't always think of myself as a guest here. And the only people who could ever claim any sense of ownership or the original inhabitants of the land, the Dakota people, would never claim that land could be owned at all. What does it feel like to be a guest everywhere? What does it feel like to be told by the descendants of white European immigrants that this is their land now? Perhaps the border, as much as it is on land, is much more in the borders in our minds and hearts, in our ease of forgetting, our ability to unremember that we own nothing. The border is around our awareness, putting separation between ourselves and hard truths. What does it feel like to dwell in the language of the birds when they take it back? The morning songs calling forth the sun, the meditative songs holding vigil in the night. What does it feel like if our language could fly across borders of land and heart to hear something singing, announcing our place in the larger family of all things, dissolving some of the separation, and still holding on to our identities? Our summer theme is Sabbath. Often it comes with ideas of rest and breath and simplicity. At its worst, it could be seen as slothful. At its best, it can be seen as soulful. And perhaps at some possibility, it allows at least for some space. It opens a space in your life to center, to reflect, to breathe, for your own heart to have room to beat, and your body and breath begin to notice and pay attention to chasms of separation built out of social constructs of race and class and gender, but also to pay attention to the connections of humanity and grief and hope and struggle and compassion. Sabbath can also be, like in the poem from Judith Terzi, a place to relinquish your fear, at least for now. Perhaps you know what that feels like. To find some place, or maybe you've been witness to someone else finding a place where they experience a relinquishment of fear, at least for now. Sometimes it can only be a moment at a time, mere breaths of Sabbath in the midst of a chaotic world, amidst all the pulls and pushes that make us feel like human taffy, pulled in 1,000 directions, where you're not sure that the heart and the soul can really take that stretching. Sometimes it's only a moment at a time where you can pause and breathe between the news cycles and pay a little more attention. Settle in a little deeper so you can notice what has always been there, the mountain, the cedar, the pine, and for a moment you gather carnations from the soil and you take a breath. That's the only way you can survive. It is to take the moments you can, but to breathe and to have Sabbath and to rest is not to go dormant. It is to center and remember your humanity and breathe so that you can get up again and create and be in relationship for a life that's worth living. Or as one activist writes about this balance, she says, on the hard, sad, angry, grievous days, and what days aren't, if you have a beating heart and you're trying to pay attention to this world, it's still okay if you share pictures of your kitten, and you open all the windows, and you sing parodies that you've invented, and you eat too many tacos, and you delete the last post that made you cry, and you brag about cleaning your bathroom, and you buy a glittery beret, and you set up a lemonade stand, and you play Scrabble with your dad, and you laugh. It's okay to find a little breathing room. That's the only way to survive. and you notice that space between you and whoever might be considered the other, and you mind that gap, and you find that middle, that there are more stories, more truth, more complexity there that are both harsh as well as beautiful, more love and heart and compassion and humanity. There in the space between us and them, perhaps we should take the border wall and flip it on its side and gather some chairs or just sit right down in the dirt and make that a feasting table where we tell stories and we break bread and we sing songs. We make no claim of proclamation or ownership over any land because we are grateful for the gift of life and soil and food and humanity. And we know and we live the fact that we are all guests and we are all welcome at the table. To have a Sabbath practice of justice is to slow down and to listen and to breathe, not rush to easy fixes as much as you want to, but to take the time a soul needs to learn something new, to open in a new way, to take the time for the heart to break open and the time for it to heal again. Yolanda Pires, African-American theologian and poet, writes, "Let us not rush to the language of healing before understanding the fullness of the injury and the depth of the wound. Let us not rush to offer a Band-Aid when the gaping wound requires surgery and complete reconstruction. Let us not rush past the loss of this mother's child, the separation of this father's child, someone's beloved child. Let us not value property over people. Let us not protect material objects while human lives hang in the balance. Let us not value a false peace over some righteous justice. Let us be silent when we do not know what to say. Let us be humble and listen to the pain and the rage and the grief pouring from our neighbors and friends. Let us center and pray with our eyes open and our bodies firmly planted on real ground." And the border wall flips, and we gather for something more beautiful than separation.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Losada, Southern Minnesota organizer with Isaiah. And I thank you all and Pastor Luke for the invitation to join you this morning and to share with you today why I work for racial and economic justice. And first, growing up in a very social justice-focused church community was a really formative experience for me. And my parents are actually here today celebrating Father's Day with me and bringing this full circle and why they chose to raise me in that kind of church community. I was enveloped into a tightly woven network of people passionate about living the way we are made to live through environmental consciousness, through nonviolent action for peace and justice, through tolerance and respect of differences, and through caring for our brothers and sisters around the world. And through my own faith journey, I have come to understand that I see God's face through other human beings, and that we are the vessel for God's love. For no other reason other than chance, I was born a white female to a family who was able to provide me with whatever I needed, a family who prioritized formal education and experiential education to understand how other people walk in this world. And I grew up seeing so much suffering around the world, and I would go through bouts of hopelessness and cynicism, thinking even with all my privilege, nothing could actually be done to heal the pain in this world. And sometimes that pain was done in the name of religion, and still is. It was overwhelming and can still be. And eventually I realized, though, that I am one person. There's still plenty I can do. And I have the responsibility and gifts. And I have to do something with those gifts to recognize others' pain. And yes, growing up in Minnesota, it's hard to recognize my own pain because we're supposed to be hardy people, we're strong people, we can survive anything, right? 7-month-long winters, mosquitoes that are now trying to steal my blood. We can survive a whole lot, and we don't often want to acknowledge our struggles too. But sometimes we need to be broken wide open to be put back together more beautifully. I don't know, some of you may have heard the Japanese tradition of when a ceramic piece is broken, then it is sealed again with veins of gold. And sometimes we ourselves need to be broken to be put back together more beautifully and to build a better world for everyone. I don't like being vulnerable with myself or with other people. But I have also been taught by the people who love me that sometimes that is a show of strength. And since I was young, I have felt called to work for social justice, which to me is not about charity or simply throwing money at an issue to hope it goes away or to soothe our conscience. It's about empathy, about truly understanding the suffering of another and feeling the suffering ourselves. It's about asking why a child goes hungry, not just today, but still tomorrow. It's about solidarity, not coming up with solutions to others' problems based on our own experiences, but by working with communities to generate solutions based on circumstances and experience of the community itself and its strengths. It's about humility and grace and walking in the footsteps of another. And that's why studying Spanish and growing up in a sanctuary church that hosted a man from El Salvador, I wanted to better understand U.S. Latin American relationships. And for years, I worked for different organizations addressing that systemic level of how I, as a U.S. citizen, need to call on my government to be a better neighbor to our Latin American neighbors. I felt called to spend a year on the U.S.-Mexico border after I graduated to gain some experiential education and intimate knowledge of the immigration issues that not only affect our southern border, but our entire country, our backyard. Since 2014, I've had the opportunity to work in Northfield on the community level, first with the Greenville Park Community School Initiative, to form relationships with students and families for academic support, community connectedness, and hopefully increased equity of opportunity. I had first come to Northfield to go to Carleton College, but as a student, you really have to step outside of the campus bubble to see what happens and how the borderlands affect our state, to see how U.S. immigration policy results in students worrying that ICE will take away their parents while they're at school. Students from mixed status or undocumented families worrying if they can afford higher education with limited to no access to financial aid. Students perhaps still affected by what they or their families had to do to make it there. And students who are so scared about the political rhetoric they're hearing around them. Working in a school where one fifth grader taunts another and says, "We're gonna build the wall and your family's gonna have to go home." And that child runs to the bathroom crying. These kids are worrying that their families are in danger. And it affects my family right now. My husband's from Mexico, and ICE has been separating families left and right. And now not even naturalized citizens are truly safe. I, as a white woman, and my husband as Latino, may feel safe or unsafe in different spaces. And as many stories as I can hear from the news and from my neighbors here about racism, hate, despair, lack of access to resources, my privilege means I'm rarely the target of hatred. But there's one story that I want to share with you. When I was working with the Greenville Park Community School, on a Monday morning, a woman called my office. She said she received our annual report in the mail and wanted to know where our funding came from. And I responded, the bulk of our funding comes from a grant from the Minnesota Department of Education, to which she proceeded to get increasingly hostile about tax dollars being used for people here illegally. And if they can't feed their families here, they need to go back where they came from. She made assumptions that the people of color on our brochure were undocumented and that they had no right to community resources. I had to calmly respond that we as public school employees cannot ask the documentation status of the students or families that we work with, and that Department of Education funding can only go to K-12 students, not parents. Other community organizations and local funding sources help us provide services to the whole family at Greenville Park. And even as I tried to explain how her tax dollars were being used, and if she was not okay with that, she could contact her school board to make suggestions about how the district should act towards its families, or how, she could contact her legislators about how her tax dollars were being used. She was not quite in the place to have that conversation, to have a human conversation, and she actually hung up mid-sentence. And that conversation shook me. And I don't know how I kept it together during that conversation, but it just my professionalism completely left after I hung up the phone. And I'm a strong woman. I didn't grow up crying ever. And I just broke down that moment. And my caring coworkers who kind of overheard the conversation were like, "What happened? We had no sense that that's what you were talking about on the phone." They reassured me that we were doing the right thing to support our students and families no matter what. And from this woman in that conversation, I heard hate, but I also heard fear. She was afraid for her family and their limited access to resources in this economy. She was afraid that if we provide services to undocumented residents, there wouldn't be enough for her family. I believe that fear is born out of misunderstanding sometimes, and out of fear comes hate. We are called to change that narrative. We are called to see our neighbors as ourselves and to love them. We are called to love them in the 2-minute interactions in the grocery store, when we walk our dogs, when we see a sign at the ice cream shop telling Muslims to get out. We are called to really see our neighbors, to understand them, to hear their life experiences, to share our own, and to work to give everybody the opportunity to thrive. And I loved my work at the Greenville Park Community School, but I needed more. I needed to invest my love in my community, in the students and families that I worked with every day, but I also needed to work for more justice-minded local, state, and national policies so that my neighbors and me can be seen as children of God. I'm so thankful that a friend introduced me to Isaiah, because it's the first social justice organization that I've been involved with that is so authentically and intentionally diverse, racially and socioeconomically, and is so driven to do that, and to do state-based work informed by one-on-one conversations. One Minnesotan to another about what they want for their family and for their community, their concerns and their hopes. It seems like everybody these days is busy though, right? And thinking about the summer Sabbath, sometimes we can be so busy surviving or feel like we need to keep up with everybody else. We're so busy surviving that we don't see how everybody else is struggling to survive too. And people all over the place, especially in Minnesota right now, especially in the United States right now, is saying we are so divided. It's a social concern. And we get stuck in our silos of like-minded people, and our like-minded people are wonderful, but we can sometimes forget that we all want the same thing. A safe and healthy family, a safe and healthy community so that our loved ones can thrive. Where we run into issues sometimes is we may have different ideas about how to go about that or what that looks like in policy form. But Isaiah is thousands of Minnesotans practicing sacrificial love, practicing getting uncomfortable so we can grow together, to hear each other's life experiences, to better know where we're called to go from here together. And you all are here on a Sunday, not just for a social hour, although there'll be some great social time later, but to be challenged on how you will live out your values. To truly know your call to racial and economic justice, I encourage you to reflect on how it's for you, not just for other people. That's the hard work. That's the reflection. If we're called to do this only for other people, it can be easy to get overwhelmed, to despair, to check out. And I've felt like this at times. Sometimes, like checking the news, and it changes every 30 seconds, and there's another terrible thing after another, and it's an avalanche, and let me just pull my covers over my head. There's nothing I can do about it, right? That's why I love my work with Isaiah. I studied international relations and Latin American studies. I like thinking big system, big picture. But where we have more agency is with our neighbors, in our local community, in our state. We can make a big impact here, but it starts with us. To keep doing that, I have to reground myself in my values. Sometimes I have to vent. Sometimes I have to snuggle with my husband and my puppy. Sometimes I have to dance or take a nature walk. I also have to get clear, though, about how white supremacy impacts me. And remember that I knew what it felt like to be an outsider. I am an only child and was a super awkward kid and can still be really awkward. And that drove me when I was younger to welcome the new student, to welcome the stranger. And I think that made me feel called to immigration justice too. So that I and people born on different sides of human-made borders can feel seen and heard, welcomed and loved too. So I invite you to consider how you can live out your faith, how you can nourish your spirit, by working to get closer to the beloved community here on earth, the kind of community that allows you, your loved ones, and your neighbors to thrive. So thank you for your time today and beyond today. Thank you for joining us also as this congregation is officially an Isaiah member congregation. Thank you for walking in this movement together and for inviting me and my co-leader, Leota, for the forum following the service. I hope that you can join us to reflect, discuss, and envision how we can act together to build the multiracial democracy that actually reflects God's love, starting with us. And now I invite you to rise in body or spirit to sing our next hymn.
I invite you, as you're comfortable, to join a hand next to you or place a hand on a shoulder or place your hand over your heart. And breathe deep the breath of life. As one poet writes, no one wants to leave home unless that home is the mouth of a shark or a place where you are unsafe. May we make our world a place where home is found and home is safe. And when ours is such, may we work for a world for those who it's not and find how it changes us too. May it be so. Amen.